Welcome to the Humanities Center for the fourth session in our 8-part series on the mountain. I'm joined here today by a treasured colleague of mine from USD's Department of Philosophy, Professor Michael Kelly. I should also say I'm really delighted that we have with us today our visiting NAP Chair of the Liberal Arts, Dr. Mitch Tomashaw, who's going to be with us for 2 weeks, so lovely to have you here. But
you'll also be giving talk on
yes,
Thursday as well as next month.
Great. There are 2 talks. Thursday lunchtime.
Thursday at lunchtime in the Science Building on perceptual reciprocity, which we're going to connect to the mountain, which Mitch will connect to the mountain, and then it's public talk next Monday.
Yes.
So noon. Noon. I'll send it through the Humanities Center. Yeah. Absolutely.
And then the main lecture is on Monday, the 14th. So the 2 of us today, Professor Kelly and I, are going to offer some reflections on the relation of the mountain to philosophers and to philosophical questions and themes. I should say at the outset that Dr. Mark Woods, Chair and Professor in the Philosophy Department, was scheduled to be a 3rd speaker today, but for entirely understandable reasons, he is sadly unable to join us today. The title of today's session specifically relates to what would have been the content of Dr. Woods' presentation. Thinking like a mountain is a term coined by the American philosopher and environmentalist Aldo Leopold, and it is to do with thinking holistically, to have a complete appreciation of one's place within an ecosystem. Now, we won't be thinking today about that in much further detail. I think you might be touching on it.
Very briefly.
Very briefly. But each of us will be thinking about the mountain and its relation to philosophical explorations of one kind or another. So a word, first of all, about Mike. Mike Kelly received his PhD from Fordham University and is professor in the Department of Philosophy. A specialist in contemporary continental philosophy, he taught at Boston College before joining USD's faculty in 2013. He has edited 5 books and is the author of, is it 2 or 3 monographs now?
2.
2 monographs, the latest of which, a phenomenological analysis of envy, was published earlier this year by Routledge. Dr. Kelly has been a regular contributor to our landscape series. Indeed, his most recent published article, which we actually co-authored, grew out of this very series, titled The Thought of the Desert and the Desert of Thought. This new article appears in an excellent volume of essays called Hosting Earth, Facing the Climate Emergency. So it's good to be back together with you, Mike.
Thanks, Brian.
It's rather like that Oasis reunion. Only just a bit cheaper for a smaller audience. We hope. Before we hear from Professor Kelly, though, I want to say a few words about the idea of a heightened perspective, or a perspective from above, particularly as this emerges in the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And I want to think about that in relation to Wittgenstein's experience of living high above a fjord in Norway. Initially, though, I want to note that for many philosophers, the view from the top of a mountain has been emblematic of the kind of perspective that a philosopher might or should aim at. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, wrote of, and I quote, the purity and rarity of the atmosphere upon high mountains, an atmosphere that produces both clarity of mind and what Rousseau calls a voluptuous tranquility. I'm not sure what that means, but it's a nice turn of phrase. Anyway, here's Rousseau, and he says in this quote from Julie, "It seems as if, being lifted above all human society, we had left every low terrestrial sentiment behind, and that as we approach the ethereal regions, the soul imbibes something of their eternal purity. There is a kind of supernatural beauty in these mountainous prospects, which charms both the senses and the minds into a forgetfulness of oneself and of everything in the world." I'm reminded again of those words by John Ruskin that I quoted a couple of weeks ago in our introductory session. Ruskin's view that the summit of the mountain exists high above all sorrow, that you get above human concerns. But let's turn to Wittgenstein, because I want to focus exclusively really on Wittgenstein. The ideal of the view from above makes its presence felt in very different ways in Wittgenstein's two classic works, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and the later Philosophical Investigations. Now, as every freshman philosophy major should be able to tell you, these two books express markedly different views of the relation of language to the world. In the Tractatus, his early masterpiece, the function of language, broadly speaking, is to picture facts, or to put this another way, to depict possible or actual factual situations in the world. As he writes, here's the Tractatus. He says, a proposition, for our purposes here, we can just think of that as a statement. A proposition is a picture of reality. A proposition is a model of reality as we imagine it. So, to simplify this enormously, the process of understanding a sentence or a statement will go something like this. A sentence is uttered, for example, here's a sentence. An event is taking place in the Humanities Center. From that combination of words, the hearer will assemble in their mind a particular picture. This familiar space, populated with attendees rather than being empty, somebody speaking, others listening, or maybe a film being screened. That kind of thing, right? That kind of picture. Now, of course, we want to know whether what we have been told is true or not. And to do that, we compare the picture to the reality. So if we enter the Humanities Center and we find it, in fact, to be empty, we will conclude that the statement, an event is taking place in the Humanities Center, is, on this occasion, false. So a statement, therefore, can be true or it can be false. It is true if it corresponds to reality, false if it does not. That's fairly straightforward. There's a third category besides the true and the false. If no picture whatsoever can be assembled from the words, the putative statement will simply be meaningless. At a stroke, then, this dispenses with vast swathes of previously cherished spheres of discourse. Ethics, aesthetics, theology, philosophy itself, since these do not trade in facts. They are void of meaning. A quick example, the sentence, the Mona Lisa hangs in the Louvre, is a perfectly acceptable statement of fact because it depicts a state of affairs. And even if it were false, it would still have a sense. But the Mona Lisa is a beautiful painting, when uttered, does not depict a fact. It's either mere gibberish or at best expresses the positive attitude of the speaker towards this painting. What the Tractatus offers us then is a very austere account of language, in which speaking meaningfully is reduced to the act of fact stating, or of describing the world empirically. To put it another way, he says in 4.11 of the Tractatus, the totality of true propositions is the whole of natural science. People might have an urge, and he recognizes that this urge is there. They might have an urge to talk about God or beauty or goodness, all of that elevated stuff. But it's really to be avoided because, famously, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. One of the great, great last sentences of any book. There's a lot to be said about that. I'm not going to say it. But it's reading the Tractatus is such a great experience because towards the end he says, well, this is a work of philosophy, and philosophy is one of those things that can't be said. So anyone who understands me recognizes that what I've said is nonsense, and then you can throw the book away. It's a beautiful, beautiful, moving experience to read that book. Now, of course, one of the things that's made the Tractatus such an evocative and engaging text is the attitude that Wittgenstein takes towards those things that cannot be spoken about. They are not the object of dismissive contempt. Instead, they are treated with some kind of reverence. Hence, he says, there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. Wittgenstein's preoccupation with matters mystical may in part have been generated by his experiences of combat in the First World War. His war notebooks reveal a movement from questions about the foundations of logic towards meditations on God, value, and the meaning of life. I also want to suggest here that the way in which these questions were framed may have something to do with Wittgenstein's pre-war mode of habitation, something to do with his experience of being in Norway. And the whole episode of Wittgenstein's movement from Cambridge to Norway exhibits aspects of the retreat to the wilderness and away from the city theme that we have encountered time and again in this series on landscape. Look, Wittgenstein was a fundamentally tormented man, and his years in Cambridge before the outbreak of the First World War, which, really, Wittgenstein welcomed the coming of the First World War because he wanted to be thrown into combat, because he could then feel that he was, as he says, face to face with death. He longed for this kind of moment. But before the war, he was especially troubled. In March of 1914, he wrote to his friend, or his then friend, Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein and Russell came to dislike each other heartily. And he wrote this to Russell: "My life is full of the ugliest and pettiest thoughts and actions imaginable." This is not an exaggeration. It's very important, I think, that he says that this is not an exaggeration. My life has been one nasty mess so far. Now, it's not too much to say that the intellectual life in Cambridge disgusted Wittgenstein. It was, he felt, largely full of shallow people trying to be clever, having these high-table meals, trying to impress each other with what they knew about the world, being very clever and witty, and he found it all very disgusting. To escape from all of that, he resolved to go and live in Norway, a place where he knew no one and could be largely alone, so that he could work without distraction on what was to become the Tractatus. Russell tried to dissuade him. It's a great photo of Bertrand Russell. Russell says, I said it would be dark, and he said he hated daylight. I said it would be lonely, and he said he prostituted his mind talking to intelligent people. I said he was mad, and he said, God preserve him from sanity. God certainly will. Russell's a great letter writer as well as other things. This is a wonderful description of his appreciation of Wittgenstein at this time. Now, the place Wittgenstein found to reside and to work was a village called Skjolden, situated by the Sonje Fjord north of Bergen. Here we have this lovely picture of Wittgenstein rowing. It's a bit murky, but it's a gorgeous photo. Despite his inescapable low spirits, Wittgenstein seemed to thrive here, at least intellectually. He said that being almost entirely by himself brought to life new movements in thinking. Then, he said this reminiscing years later, then my mind was on fire. It's a great idea, this idea of him being alone in this it's not quite a wilderness, but it's far away from clever British life. His mind being on fire. And in a postscript added to a letter to Russell from June 1914, Wittgenstein says simply this: I am now building myself a small house here, miles from anyone. I'm now, this is all that one line, I'm now building myself a small house here, miles from anyone. And he built this house, more properly a hut, high above the fjord. And it was intended by him to be his permanent residence. And there you can see what he built up there. The Great War interrupted his plan of living there, but he would return to this Norwegian hut on numerous occasions during the rest of his life. There's a couple of views of the hut here. Here it is as it was originally, and then it fell into disrepair and it has been reconstructed. Here, you can actually visit this. And with this, you can see the perspective from the hut. He's high up, looking down. Now, what follows is speculation, but I want to suggest that this elevated position high above the fjord on the mountainside informs some of the most memorable aspects of Wittgenstein's thought. For example, note this line from the Tractatus. This is from the passages on the mystical. He says, how things are in the world is a matter of complete indifference for what is higher. God does not reveal himself in the world. Now, it's not impossible that Wittgenstein is writing those words with something like a sense of relief. The memory of being high up above the fjord with all the facile hurly-burly of superficial social life viewed from above, here with a blissful indifference. It's going on down here, well below us, and I'm up here. This brings to mind, I think, something he would later write about our life here in this vexing world of ours. These are great photos of Wittgenstein, his self-portraits. I absolutely love these. But he says, man exists in this world where things break, slide about, cause every imaginable mischief. And of course, he is one such thing himself. This is a very interesting idea. And I do want to say that those words, with their emphasis on the fragile instability of things, remind me very much of some more famous lines from T.S. Eliot's four quartets from the poem Burnt Norton, where Eliot, great photo of Eliot, says, words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. And of course, all of that leading up to the poem's devastating final line, ridiculous the waste, sad time, stretching before and after. Now, despite all the vexations and trials of this, our sublunary world, there is, Wittgenstein suggests, a way of experiencing it that captures its significance, a way that is central to what he has termed the mystical. So again, towards the end of the book, he says, to view the world sub specie aeterni is to view it as a whole, a limited whole, feeling the world as a limited whole. It is this that is mystical. A word about that is in order. The view of the world sub specie aeterni, or sub specie aeternitatis, which is a conspicuous element in the philosophy of Spinoza, is to view things under the aspect of eternity, or in relation to the eternal. Stuart Sutherland, who was one of my professors back in the 80s in London, who wrote a brilliant and criminally neglected book, God, Jesus and Belief, one of many criminally neglected books. Sutherland characterizes the perspective, sub specie aeternitatis, as the great jewel lying at the heart of theistic belief. And these words of his are important, I think. There are two jewels which lie at the heart of the possibility of a view sub specie aeternitatis. The first defines the hope, and indeed the belief, that there is an understanding of the affairs of men which is not relative to the outlook of individual, community, or age. The second, which crowns that, is the implication that such a view is not even relative to the outlook of mankind. It's the promise of a view which is beyond our own, well beyond our own. I want to make three very brief remarks about this. I want to stress, first of all, how for Sutherland, this jewel flows from the idea of God's omniscient perspective on human affairs, a perspective which is suggestive of height, or a view from above. Secondly, the character of such a perspective always brings, at least in my mind, Schopenhauer's words about the eagle's lofty solitude. It's a great theme in Schopenhauer. It seems a perspective attained individually, as it were, far away from the crowd. Hence Wittgenstein's solitude by the fjord. Hence also the lonely fate of those who seek to acquire such a detached and elevated view of things. I want to register in this context Thomas Babington Macaulay's assessment of a 17th century statesman and greatest man who ever lived, the Marquis of Halifax. I am contractually obliged to mention Halifax on every public occasion. Macaulay said about Halifax, Halifax always saw passing events, not in the point of view in which they commonly appear to one who bears a part in them, but in the point of view in which, after the lapse of many years, they appear to the philosophic historian. With such a turn of mind, he could not long continue to act cordially with any body of men. There you see the eagle's lofty solitude. Halifax was distrusted by everybody, partly for this perspective. There's a lovely story about Halifax entering into Westminster Hall, and one of the court wits of the period. Halifax is alone walking into Westminster Hall, and someone says, yonder goes the Marquis of Halifax with all of his friends. There is this perspective of not being part of the rush of things, but somehow viewing things, which is the opposite of the party spirit, we might say, of party tribalism. You don't make many friends that way. It's much better to throw yourself into a group of people who all think the same way. We live in such a time, of course. And he's the guide out of this time. Anyway, thirdly, it's natural to see the mountain as the vantage point, the very place where a view sub specie aeternitatis might be attained, because you are high above things. Now, in the final part of this talk, I just want to shift ground for a moment and note an important feature of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. It is true that the account of the nature of language found in his later philosophical investigations stands very much opposed to what he had earlier contended. Now, in the later philosophy, language is viewed not as one thing, not as a vehicle for the depiction of facts, but as a collection of highly diverse language games. Within this later philosophy, regions of discourse are not banished into a realm of silence, but each region is allowed to stand for itself, speak for itself. Each has its own distinctive character, rules of engagement, and so on and so forth. But I want to say that the mountain perspective, that perspective attained high above the fjord, persists in this later philosophy. And it persists by virtue of Wittgenstein's intensive quest for what he calls surveyability. Surveyability. A word about this. Philosophy, as practiced by Wittgenstein, is minutely engaged with the nature and uses of language and with the way that language can mislead us, especially when we are engaged with philosophy. Now, I can't get into the details of this here. We haven't got time, but note these remarks. He says, we are struggling with language. We are engaged in a struggle with language. Philosophy is a struggle against the bewitchment of our understanding by means of language. Now, one of the ways in which language misleads or bewitches us, he thinks, and I'm oversimplifying things here, is due to its written or spoken uniformity. Words look the same when they are written down, whether the subject is oceanography, theology, ethics, history, or whatever. This leads us to think that there might be a greater uniformity in their subject matter than there really is. For example, the word God looks like it's the name of a person, as Ron is the name of a person. And then we go about looking for the person whose name is God, and so on. Another example. The uniformity of language might lead us to think that the Last Judgment, as a religious idea, is the name of a future event, analogous to the upcoming presidential election, like things that are about to happen at some point in the future. Wittgenstein's point is that when you pay attention to the uses of language or to different language games, you will see differences rather than uniformities. Something different is going on when you engage in religious language, something very unlike, for example, scientific language. They are not to be conflated. So what we really need, he thinks, and what we conspicuously lack, is what he calls an Übersicht of language, a word variously translated as surveyable representation, overview, or most telling, given our preoccupation here with height, a bird's eye view. Get that? A bird's eye view of language, of the uses and workings of language, a view from above, he says. There's some philosophical investigations. A main source of our failure to understand is that we don't have an overview of the use of our words. Our grammar is deficient in surveyability. The concept of a surveyable representation is of fundamental significance for us. Now, that's a complicated matter, and I'm not going to delve deeper into it. All I want to stress here is that the ideal of surveyability expresses a desire for a clear view of things, an unobstructed view. And Wittgenstein connects this clear view with the view of things sub specie aeternitatis, a view which might be attained mystically, or via a work of art, or simply via clear thinking, he says. Another, he was a very photogenic figure. Always, intensity of thought comes across in all these photos. It seems to me, too, that there is a way of capturing the world sub specie aeterni other than through the work of the artist. Thought has such a way, so I believe. It is as though it flies above the world and leaves it as it is, observing it from above in flight. So here we have then in Wittgenstein a network of ideas of the view from eternity, of a position permitting surveyability, of a bird's eye view, and here of thought in flight, connected perhaps with a philosopher's isolated little hut on the side of a mountain, giving the promise of just such a view of things. And with that, I am delighted to welcome my colleague and my very good friend, Dr. Mike Kelly.
I gave a talk on the desert when we were going through the desert series, and that seems to have, I think, coincided more effectively with my persona. And talking about mountains and aspirational ideas is kind of a bit foreign to me. So I will say some probably fairly platitudinous things at the beginning about mountains. Hopefully a couple of the insights will be of some use, or maybe even worthy of the word insight. And then I will kind of pivot away from that to a couple of short interpretations of Nietzsche and what he has to say about mountains, Camus in reinterpretation of the myth of Sisyphus, and then I suppose a fairly snarky word about Aldo Leopold in conclusion. A bit of a provocation, perhaps. We'll see how it goes. I've been very busy. I'm going to read my paper off my phone, so to see how that goes. But first, I would like to start the timer on myself so that I don't go for too long. Yeah. All right, here we go. The kind of rough title of this is something like Mountains from Teleology to the Undoing of Teleology. And teleology, just in the event that you might not know, is the study of things and their kind of innate or intrinsic purposes, the kinds of designs that are given to them that they must kind of through various forms of behavior either actualize or corrupt. So mountains across time and culture have been thought in their godliness, somewhat nearly literally in Japanese Shinto mythology. Fujisan, or Mount Fuji, is thought to be one of two gods having risen from the ground. In the Western world, mountains have long held a symbolic presence in philosophy and theology. That is to say, they were often thought of as a sign or a material presence that points towards something absent. Its solid structure that appears constant and permanent signifies, or say semiotically or symbolically, represents order and eternity, thanks to the mountain's mode of seeming semi-permanence. As it points to the sky, a mountain points to the heavens, and from its heights, if we can imagine being at its summit, it symbolizes a place of perspective, maybe surveyability, perhaps an approximation of a God's eye view on the whole, both spatially and perhaps temporally. Plato's cave, as it signified an inversion of a mountain, symbolized the realm of mere, unstable, unclear opinions or mere beliefs about truth, goodness, and beauty that the philosopher aimed to encourage us to overcome. Perhaps the philosopher, we could imagine, would leave the cave and then climb to Delphi, atop Mount Parnassus. Indeed, this is the place, Mount Parnassus and the oracle at Delphi, from which Socrates' divine vocation stemmed, a vocation during which he endorsed a view of truth, goodness, and beauty as eternal virtues, eternal, permanent, unchanging, like a mountain, symbolically. If philosophy in the West starts with Socrates' vocation, then maybe we can say that philosophy in the West starts from such a godlike view of or symbol found in a mountain. The same can perhaps be said of theology, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. Moses receives the Decalogue from Mount Sinai. This code of behavior was designed to put human being in right relationship to God and thereby realize its nature as a creature created in the image of God. And Jesus Christ, as you may know, intensifies the social element of the commandments from the Decalogue in Leviticus 19:18 regarding love of other and oneself. Christ, it is thought, did not, or as he said, did not overturn the Decalogue in his so-called Sermon on the Mount, which is thought to have taken place on a hill in northern Israel, now called Mount Beatitude. But he instead preached the path to orienting oneself to a world in such a way that God occupied a place of priority in the human being's life. Indeed, the central place in the human being's life. As it is said in the Sermon on the Mount, in the so-called Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, not my kingdom come, thy will be done, not my will be done. We might find the entirety of Christianity in those lines delivered from that Sermon on that Mount, delivered here, of course, along with the Beatitudes, or guidelines for making one's life blessed, that is to say, making one's life happy, or beatitudo. What perspective indeed? If one wants salvation, if one wants salve, well-being, or flourishing, one must have right relation to God. And if one wants right relation to God, one must will as God wills, as revealed from a mountain. On both of these accounts, the kind of ancient philosophical account, or Athens, and the Judeo-Christian account, or Jerusalem, the dominant traditions in the West, on both of these accounts, mountains symbolize the true, the good, and the beautiful as eternal objects to be known, or they symbolize the place from which eternal truths get revealed. In any case, mountains symbolized what we would call the teleological worldview, in which human beings had an essence that it needed to actualize through, in the case of Greek philosophy, rational life, or in the case of Judeo-Christian theology, faithful living. But mountains would come to symbolize the challenge to the teleological vision of human welfare, the teleological vision of beatitude or blessedness or happiness. Whatever one makes of Nietzsche's claim that one thinks one's best thoughts in the mountains high above everyday life, something he himself did for a decade wandering the Alps, Nietzsche brings philosophy and theology down from the mountains. And what he brings down from the mountains to everyday life was what he called a gift. And that gift, in Nietzsche's view, was the gift of the insight in the mode of a rejection of all that mountains had previously symbolized. There was, according to Nietzsche, no permanence, no order, no stability, no eternity, whether an eternal virtue, as Socrates sought, or an eternal God, as preached by the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the mountains, Nietzsche thought the thought of the death of God, and from the mountain where he drew his insight, he came down to pronounce that destabilizing claim of chaos over order, impermanence over permanence, and the correlative idea that each human being, in the absence of these ordered prospects or guidelines, was to make his or her own life through his or her own choices. Let's listen to how he reinterprets Plato's allegory of the cave and the philosopher thinking his way out, coming to see the sun as the symbolic and eternal unchanging good that was supposedly the cause of all things, both being and being known. I'm going to turn to the opening of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is the prologue. I'm going to read just a bit of it and along the way comment on the symbolism in it. Zarathustra's prologue, and Nietzsche basically is Zarathustra. He just gives himself a better name than Friedrich. All right. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, and anybody who's reading this should kind of clearly recognize the allusion to the beginning of Christ's ministry. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and his lake of his home, and he went into the mountains. He enjoyed his spirit and his solitude for 10 years and did not tire of it. This is, of course, the 10 years that Nietzsche spent wandering the Alps. But at last a change came over his heart, and one morning he rose with the dawn and stepped before the sun, and he spoke to the sun thus: "You great star, what would your happiness be had you not those for whom you shine? For 10 years you have climbed up to my cave. You would have tired of your light in the journey had it not been for me and my eagle and my serpent." What is going on here, for those of us who are familiar with the history of philosophy, is a clear kind of narrative inversion of Plato's allegory of the cave, where the philosopher eventually, in some way that's difficult to kind of grasp, is able to kind of escape the bonds of being chained and looking at shadows on the wall to emerge out of the cave up to see the sun, which, of course, is symbolic, as we've said, of the good. Nietzsche kind of stands this entire reference on its head at the opening of the prologue to Zarathustra, and so in one paragraph basically announces an overturning of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Platonic tradition all at once. He wants to suggest in some sense that what makes meaning is not human beings discovering the true or the good or the beautiful as something there to be discovered as eternal, unchanging, and permanent, but instead that the human being and his or her own constructs are what make meaning. Right? So he kind of moves us from a transcendent view of meaning formation to a kind of more earthly or existential view of human meaning. Nietzsche's work in this sense is kind of symbolized by the inversion of the mountain work is such that he kind of takes this message and he comes down in the Prologue to Zarathustra from the mountain. Instead of ascending, he comes back down and he delivers to the people in the marketplace the news of the death of God. One of the things that it does, or it's so thought to do, is kind of break up the tradition in Western philosophy that had largely been dominant before Nietzsche regarding the idea that there is a certain kind of objective truth, maybe even a stronger version of universal truth, that any human being through rational activity of a certain kind of concerted effort could come to know. It was universal. It held in all times, in all places, for all persons. And he introduces a view that's much more perspectival, stemming from the opinions of individuals, whether they be cultural opinions or whether they be individual opinions. I think that his work kind of moves in the end in two interesting kind of directions, one of which is existentialism. And there's something here about Nietzsche's kind of breakdown of universal versions of truth and the kind of movement to making human beings as a kind of center of the formation of meaningfulness or truth that existentialism kind of picks up and runs with. One of the kind of famous lines of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. What they mean by that is that what you choose and how you commit to your choices really kind of builds up who you are and your character, where character becomes something like essence in that sense, always kind of malleable. That's quite the opposite of what we might see from this kind of mountainous view from the Platonic tradition or the Judeo-Christian tradition, where in each of these places, they would not say that existence precedes essence, but rather the reverse. They would say that essence precedes existence. So you have a certain kind of essence, teleologically speaking, that you need to kind of actualize by following certain kinds of guidelines, whether they be the Beatitudes or the Decalogue or something like this. So existentialism kind of moves the source of meaning back to human activity and human freedom. That's one place that I think we kind of see philosophy go after the influence of Nietzsche, and that's into the kind of story of existentialism. And I'll talk about that just in a second more. And the other place I think it goes is to a certain kind of interesting, Nietzsche likes to talk about love of the earth rather than love of the things above the earth, and a kind of a certain strange, in my opinion, type of eco philosophy that kind of gets developed out of Nietzsche's work. In the existential tradition, I would like to kind of refer, because we're talking about mountains, to Albert Camus' reinterpretation of the myth of Sisyphus. Whereas Sisyphus is kind of designed in Camus' reinterpretation to symbolize a life that on its surface looks positively meaningless. If you know the myth, Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to kind of eternally roll a boulder up a hill, only to have the boulder roll back down, and then wake up again in the morning and see the boulder and have to engage in the same activity over and over and over again. It's a certain kind of Greek mythological Groundhog Day, or not unlike my week, if you want to think of it that way. So what Camus wants to do here is say, look, that life looks to be utterly meaningless. Like there's just seemingly no purpose to that life. Every time he accomplishes the very same task, that accomplishment is undone and it needs to be reaccomplished again, right? It seems to be the case that there's no purpose there, there's no telos, there's no end that's being achieved or accomplished. And in the absence of there being a kind of end to be achieved or accomplished, where then do you end up finding meaning, right? So you can kind of see something like that opening up from Nietzsche's kind of work. And if we're going to destroy the teleological worldview that we got out of the Greeks and out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, what's going to be the meaning source that kind of fills that void? And Camus says, I don't know, maybe like if we look at Sisyphus, maybe there isn't any. But then, of course, for Camus, the big question, the philosophical question becomes, why not commit suicide, right? And what Camus wants to do is reinterpret the myth of Sisyphus to show what we might call a non-teleological view of meaningfulness. That's to say that the meaning of the action will not be found outside of the action itself and what it produces, but it will be found precisely in the action itself, right? And this is why he says of Sisyphus that Sisyphus, quote, makes his rock his thing. You know, Sisyphus is representative of a person who, in spite of the sheer monotony and apparent meaninglessness of his life, finds himself to be happy just by being the master and controller of his fate. And it's not in what he produces, it's not in what he achieves, it's in the fact that he has the freedom to decide to continue to engage that activity itself. So the meaningfulness of his life is intrinsically bound up merely with the actions and the choices that he himself makes, no matter how restricted they are by his fate. As Camus finishes up the text in a rather kind of surprising line, he says, "So I will leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burdens again, but Sisyphus teaches a higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. The universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the height is enough to fill a man's heart. We must imagine Sisyphus happy." There's a kind of conclusion to that story. And so I think with the last couple of minutes that I have, I will say something about the other direction that I think we can kind of find Nietzsche's philosophy opens up, and that's a kind of eco-philosophy. So as Brian had mentioned already, the title of our session for today alludes to Aldo Leopold's invitation to appreciate the connectedness of all entities in the ecosphere. Today, Leopold's exhortation has generated a certain kind of hysteria around the notion of what is being called deep time. How old is a mountain? Deep time. Try to think like a mountain. How old is a mountain? Geologists can estimate this for us. Having rose above sea level some 30 million years ago, if I try to think like a mountain, this would be, say, San Juan. What's the one up in San Juanito? Is that the one up in Borrego Springs? Am I getting that right? Thank you very much. Yep, that's it. 30 million years ago, right? So if I'm going to think like a mountain, that particular mountain, we're talking about thinking like something that's about 30 million years old. But if I try to think like a mountain, I find that I am baffled. I am destroyed. I am condemned to my insignificance, and the insignificance perhaps too of my species. I cannot think that thought. And if you don't believe me, try to think something like 3,872 marbles. I cannot think that thought. I cannot, if I'm being honest, even imagine it. In our times today, when we like to discuss the difficulty of thinking like fellow human beings with significant cognitive, national, ethnic, racial, gender, and sexual differences, I am told that I cannot know what it is like to be X or Y because I lack X or Y feature. If I cannot even think like another human creature with whom I share so much in common, I cannot comprehend the exhortation to think like a mountain. Something has to change in the way that we're thinking. At best, if I were to try to think like a mountain, I'm like the person Pascal describes, annihilated by the vastness of the universe to which the peak of the mountain leads our gaze. So I close with a depressing quote from Pascal. I see the terrifying spaces of the universe that enclose me, and I find myself attached to a corner of this vast expanse. Without knowing why I am more in this place than another place, nor why this little time that is given to me to live is assigned to me at this point more than another point, out of all of the eternity that has preceded me, and out of all of the eternity that will follow me. Thank you.